Okay, well, I'm just going to get started because we've got quite a lot to get through. After this talk, there'll be a screening of the first episode of Monkey. So basically what we wanted to do was to sort of introduce Monkey really, where it came from, what it is, how it relates to the exhibitions upstairs. The first thing I should do is kind of make a confession, which is I have no expertise whatsoever in Chinese language, history, culture, or anything else. So I'm really doing this as someone who just spent an awful lot of time in my younger days and quite a bit of time in my current days watching things like Monkey and Kung Fu films and all the rest of it. And I suppose, you know, this is really sort of trying to join the dots of a lot of different things and sort of try and see how this story got from ancient China, prehistoric times, to 1978 in Japan and the BBC and playgrounds throughout the Western world. And it's quite an intriguing story. So to get started, I thought I'd just make a few introductory notes. And the first thing is to say that in an essay called Chinese Tricksters, a writer named Denita Fleck groups Huang Yong Ping, the artist upstairs, with three other Chinese artists, Zhu Bing, Gu Wenda, and Song Dong, as artists who've, and in her words, taken on the role of trickster in modern Asian society and in the worldwide art community, revealing ideas and developments which have been hidden or denied. They add their stories to the long Chinese history of fools, misfits, and trickster characters in folklore, fables, and mythology. The government of the People's Republic of China and its official press organizations have long used the trickster label to identify and denigrate any Chinese or non-native individual or group deemed to be a threat to the Communist Party. So that's what Denita Fleck says about this thing. It's in this light that Monkey seems very relevant to both Huang Yong Ping's own work and the role played by artists in China more generally during the past 2 or 3 decades. As Fleck goes on to point out specifically of Monkey, surely the best known of all Chinese trickster figures, the Monkey King is said to have been born from a stone, fertilized by the wind, rain, and sun, and so contains within himself all of the 4 elements of the universe. He's essentially a troublemaker, an opportunist, and he's punished by the gods. So it's a subtly political resonance that probably isn't lost on Chinese artists. And there's something quite satisfying about the way that the BBC's promotional coverage for the Beijing Olympics in 2008 actually drew on this and put together Ai Weiwei's Olympic Stadium with Jamie Hewlett's animation of Monkey. So let's, where's the library gone? Here we go. So let's, so if we watch this film, it just puts those two things together really, an artist like Ai Weiwei and the trickster story of Monkey. So there you have something which, and including, I hadn't noticed before, the red snapping plants as they approach the stadium as well, which may be significant. I mean, what the Chinese authorities might have made of that is anybody's guess, given that, as Danita Fleck points out, they use trickster as an insulting term to denigrate opponents. So what they thought of that is anybody's guess. The other thing about this clip is that it shows that there are lots of other ways of representing monkey other than the 1978 Japanese TV series that we'll see later, although that is the best known version in the West. Before moving on to look at the background of this story's own journey to the West, it may be worth comparing Hewlett's animation with the 1960 Japanese version, which, in addition to anything else, tells us that the 1978 series wasn't Japan's first attempt at bringing this Chinese story to film. This version is called Sayuki. It was made by the Toei Animation Studio, which was it was a hothouse for Ghibli studios as well. And it appeared at a time, which Monkey seems to do, of cultural transition. This Sayuki was released in the same year that various future members of a band called the Spiders, that we'll hear more about later, first started to become musically active. So there may be a more than passing connection between this version and the version we'll watch later. So this is, again, it's really a compilation of clips and trailers, but it gives you an idea.
体の毛を抜いてずっと吹きゃなんでも望み次第不思議な術だよ驚くな何にもないさ。じゃあ、私、お友達になってあげるわ。思い出の明かりをつ
So there you have like a sense of how that particular version uses a lot of the Disney type material and also, you know, introduces bits of Godzilla and other popular things. So this is obviously a story that absorbs whatever you throw at it in many ways. So who or what is Monkey? As Danita Fleck notes, his character corresponds to the profile of the trickster, quick-witted and defiant, full of self-belief and a sense of his own worth. He has a way of causing havoc wherever he goes and bows to no authority. Despite possessing some magical powers, he generally overcomes his enemies through a combination of cunning and brute force, often creating problems for himself and his companions through impulse, but then using exactly the same qualities to engineer solutions. It's possible that Monkey shares some roots with the Hindu monkey god Hanuman, and I do have an image here somewhere, if I can find it. Where have they gone? They've disappeared. Let me find them. Stills. Yeah, so here's Hanuman. This is an Indian painting of him. And it's possible that he shares some roots with Monkey. They may have had origins in the same time and place. Hanuman's own origin myth suggests that as a child he believed the sun to be a ripe fruit and desired to eat it whole. He can change his size from minuscule to the scale of the universe. And in one Hanuman story, when the deity is unable to identify a particular sacred plant, he simply carries the whole mountain back to the battlefield in order to ensure the herb is delivered to the one who needs it. These traits seem to support an idea that Hanuman and Monkey may well have grown from the same mythic root, but this isn't actually certain. That's entirely speculative. So step one on our journey becomes the birth of Monkey. Both the novel, and for those who've seen it will remember the TV series, begins with accounts of Monkey's creation. In the novel's first paragraph, the Jade Emperor is startled by a mysterious light and dispatches 2 guards to open the gate of the southern heaven and investigate. They report back in the following words. This light comes from the border of the land of Ao Lai, which lies to the east of the holy continent from the mountain of flowers and fruit. On this mountain is a magic rock which gave birth to an egg, and this egg gave birth to a stone monkey. When he made his bow to the 4 quarters, a steely light flashed from his eyes with a beam that reached the palace of the pole star. But now he's taking a drink and the light's growing dim. The rest of Monkey's origin myth is covered in the pilot episode, Monkey Goes Wild About Heaven, that we'll see shortly, so I won't go into any more detail here. It's enough to say that the episode ends at around chapter 7 of the novel, and there are 500 years between the end of this episode and chapter 7 of the novel and the beginning of the next episode, or chapter 8 of the novel. And if we move on... So now the person who rescues Monkey after that 500 years at the end of those sections is a monk named Tripitaka. And as this shows, at some point in their history, the monkey stories, which are very, very irreverent, become entangled with Buddhism. I suppose in the same way that stories in England became entangled with Christianity and so on. So it's likely that Monkey's author, Wu Cheng-en, drew heavily on the published autobiographical accounts of a real-life monk named Xuan Zhang, who made a 17-year pilgrimage to India beginning in 629 AD, with the intention of studying and bringing previously unavailable sutras and Buddhist teachings back to the China of the Tang dynasty. It was a dangerous journey, crossing many of the warring states within China, as well as large parts of the territory that now lies within the borders of modern-day Pakistan, Nepal, Afghanistan, India, and possibly a few other places. In the novel, Xuanzang is given the name Tripitaka, though actually this is an honorary title that was conferred on him in his own lifetime, not his name. The Tripitaka are a body of Buddhist texts, and the title denotes knowledge and understanding of them. But the fact that Xuanzang's adventures in the 6th century are real is indisputable. He, in the guise of Tripitaka, and his 6th century journey to India is one of 2 points at which the journey to the West, the monkey novel, actually touches on reality. As evidence, we can just make one reference to the fact in 1908, a former Buddhist monument called the Kanishka Stupa in Peshawar was actually rediscovered by a British archaeological team who simply followed his description of visiting the place 1,000 years earlier, or more than 1,000 years earlier. There were already legends about his pilgrimage circulating in his own lifetime, and it's possible, though not known, that links to monkey might already have been being woven into these by the time of his death, and certainly within the 7th and 8th centuries. But it's worth remembering that his actual journey was no less remarkable than the legend it spawned. And the second point of contact between reality and the story is the sole responsibility of Wu Cheng'en, who is the author of the novel as it's come down to us. He was a Ming Dynasty bureaucrat, and he's traditionally credited as the novel's author, although it's worth pointing out that all editions published before the 20th century were anonymous. He was briefly a minor official because he only passed his imperial examinations in middle age, but he's rumoured to have not enjoyed his work at all and resigned and spent his later years as a hermit in his hometown in Jiangsu province, writing poetry and fiction. And one of the things he wrote there included Journey to the West, which is the original title of the monkey novel. His distaste for political corruption wasn't a secret. The book was written in the 1590s, and despite its ancient setting, openly satirises many very specific aspects of the Ming culture of his own time. When you watch the episode, you'll see that the imperial hierarchies in the heavenly realms that Monkey visits are basically, these are Ming dynasty bureaucracies and courts and emperors simply transferred into the clouds, and they're every bit as corrupt and incompetent as their earthly versions. Despite this, it's assumed that the book's anonymity was not due to this vein of satire. He wasn't trying to protect himself, because he clearly seems not to have made any secret of any of this at all. Instead, I think it relates to the vernacular style of the writing, and this was kind of very starkly at odds with the prevailing literary models in his own time, which always referred back to the elegance of classical Tang dynasty styles, the kind of poetry that was being written in the time when Xuanzang was actually on his pilgrimage. So I think he concealed his authorship mainly to protect his literary reputation, because association with a work as vulgar and ridiculous in many ways as Monkey would probably have undermined his ambition for other things he did to be taken seriously. It seems his authorship was an open secret in his hometown, though, and written records link the book to him as early as, within 10, 20 years of its first edition. But the association was never really known outside. The correspondence of the book's portrayal of earthly society with his own views of the Ming bureaucracy certainly supports his case as the most likely author, though how far he created the framework and details of the story we know today, and how far he simply collated existing oral sources and traditions, none of that is really known. There are no particular records. But his version did prove definitive. And in the next clip I'll show there's a 1965 animated version made for the Chinese market, probably given that this was the height of the Cultural Revolution. It would probably have been distributed more in places like Hong Kong and the like than, China itself. But if we watch this, we can see that, this particular scene occurs in the episode we'll watch later. And really, it plays some variations on it, but really, it just shows how closely every version since has stuck to.
大仙，请看，
这是什么？
这个宝贝大有来历，这是禹王治水时留下来的一根定海神针。大仙要是拿得动，就送给大仙。
是个宝贝。好宝贝，好宝贝，可惜太粗了一点，细一点就好了。再细一点。如意金箍棒，重36000斤，小。老邻居，俺老孙多谢了。
这是我镇海之宝，你不能拿走。
只要我拿得动，就送给我，难道你说了不算吗？
大仙，请看，
这是什么？
Get rid of that. As you can see in that clip, that you've got really there is like it's almost like an animated Chinese opera, and the way the little cartoon monkey is done in that is very much the kind of makeup that I've seen, like looking at, contemporary productions, musical productions in China and opera productions, and so that is kind of some sort of monkey makeup. So. But moving on, the last, we've just jumped sort of quite a long way from the 6th century to the 1590s to get the book written. The next leap is equally big, takes us from the 1590s to, literally the 1920s. So step 4 is Arthur Waley. And Arthur Waley is a crucial link in the story of monkey's transmission between East and West. He was born in 1889 with the surname, his name was Arthur David Schloss, and he was born to a family of expatriate Romanian Jews in London. His mother reverted to her maiden name, which was Whaley, as a response to the anti-German atmosphere at the outbreak of the First World War in England. And he studied at Rugby and Cambridge. Although he was supposed to join his uncle's export business after he graduated, he actually used his literary contacts to obtain what turned out to be an initially very dull job at the British Museum print rooms. He once described it as spending entire days counting German book plates. So I'm sure we've all had jobs like that. Fortunately for him and for us, the division of his department into Oriental and European sections in 1913 changed everything. He joined the new Oriental print section and began to teach himself first Chinese and then a little bit later Japanese. While learning the first of the languages, he honed his skills by translating poetry, and in 1915 he self-published a selection, and he described it himself as, "For a few pounds I had about 40 short poems printed, bound them in some spare wallpaper, and sent the resulting booklet to a number of friends as a sort of Christmas card." The response to this was not at first especially favourable, but a few things worked in his favour, including the foundation of a School of Oriental Studies in London and a friendship with T.S. Eliot, who'd recently, literally, I think he arrived in London about 1913, 1914, so he met him. And this meant that by 1917, a few years later, his Chinese translations were appearing in both Ezra Pound's Little Review and the Oriental School's official bulletins. A year later, this led to a commercial publisher agreeing to produce an anthology of his versions called 170 Chinese Poems, and that's a book that's remained in print pretty much ever since. As the 1920s and 30s went on, there were a lot more opportunities for a writer with Arthur Whaley's interests. New styles of poetry like imagism and free verse had found Chinese and Japanese models of very special interest. So he found himself at the heart of modernism in a way, while he himself was really doing nothing more than pursuing his own slightly eccentric path. And it was in this context that in 1940 and 41, he started, by his own admission as a way of escaping the realities of London during the Blitz, to start translating Monkey. The atmosphere in which it arrived is summed up in a letter to him from Edith Sitwell, which was written in 1952 after she'd read her own copy of the translation. And she says, "I do not know of any work which so abolishes the horrors of this time and our wretched material worries. One returns to ordinary life when one has to, feeling entirely at peace. How strange it is to come back from Monkey and realise how hideous people are making the world." And although it was a very severe abridgment of the original, the 1942 Monkey includes 30 of the original 100 chapters. A full version didn't really appear in English till the early 1980s. But his versions of this and other kind of Chinese and Japanese texts were ridiculously influential. The impact of these on, just to take one example, like American artists and writers around Black Mountain College in the late 30s and 40s, the embryonic beats, New York avant-gardes and abstract expressionists, people like John Cage, Alan Watts, Kenneth Rexroth, Mark Tobey and a lot of others, it just can't be underestimated. And the American 60s owes a lot to this man who, in 1913, had just decided it'd be a good idea to teach himself a new language. And despite having no real qualifications for doing it, began translating a few Chinese poems into English and binding them in wallpaper. So, it's interesting how this kind of comes about, really, but it just comes down to the slightly obsessive thing of one particular person. And we'll now sort of take another bit of a leap to the 1960s that Whaley had such an influence on.
の女の子は男嫌いの印なのさ教えておくれ君の名前男はみんなひざまずく夏の渚は恋でいっぱいなのに僕は一人で泣いている白いドレスの女の子は僕が夢見たエンジェルなのさ教えておくれ君の名前たった一人の女友達ドレスの女の子は哀れな恋の一人者教えておくれ君の名前男はみんな白状者さ夏の渚は恋でいっぱいなのに僕は一人で泣いている白いドレスの女の子は僕が夢見たエンジェルなのさ教えておくれ君の名前たった一人の女友達
So we'll pause that and bring up the next step, which is this lot. And if you look at the third person along from me, that is the point of particular interest in relation to Monkey. If Whaley took the east to the west, the Spiders gave the process a curious twist by bringing the western sounds of 60s beat music to the east and then returning them to Europe in new shapes. The particular significance of the Spiders to the evolution of Monkey lies in the role of Masaki Sakai, which is him pulling the pose there at the front, who became the actor who played Monkey in the 1978 series and is obviously one of the key factors in the continuing appeal of that series. He was one of the two front men in the band, the other is on the other side, and between them they were renowned for kind of clowning around. And they even had a routine called the Monkey Dance, which in turn led to a song called Mr. Monkey, which they released in 1966. I couldn't actually find any footage of this dance, so unfortunately we won't be able to see it at this point, although they are still touring in Japan, so if ever you fancy catching it, I'm sure they may do a slightly more subdued version of it these days. And it's not known really if this past form with monkeying around had any kind of bearing on his selection for the role of King Monkey. But it's, you know, again, I think it's interesting to sort of locate this within that sort of particular Japanese pop cultural context. And, you know, this is obviously where the series comes from ultimately. just to play out from that, there's another television performance by the Spiders, very different, this time from a show called New Elekki Sound, in which the group participated in a battle of the bands, and they perform with a rather colourful go-go troupe on this one.
Go 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 風が泣いている Go 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 風が叫んでる Go 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 誰を追いかけてゆくの何がそんなに悲しいのさ夜更けも午後暴れる午後嵐の午後午後ゴゴゴ風が鳴きながらゴゴゴゴゴゴ風が踊ってるゴゴゴどうせ帰らない恋なら早く忘れた方がいい夜更けも午後踊れよ午後嵐の午後午後嵐の午後午後
So there you have a very, very young Masaki Sakai, sort of in the green shirt, singing. And obviously they put that to use on the series because he does perform quite a few of the songs that you hear, not the actual title theme, but quite a few of other songs on the soundtracks of the episodes. He does perform them. But after the 60s, really, the pace steps up in terms of the transmission of Monkey into the West. And this history is becoming more and more entangled with popular culture. It's sort of moving out of a sort of literary context into a more general popular context. And perhaps the final deciding factor in this journey, or at least to the fact that it made it to BBC television screens, is the success of martial arts films in the UK and America during the 60s and early 70s. A number of successful Hong Kong films had already been imported and dubbed, but the first effort actually financed by Hollywood, a Bond-like kung fu movie starring a Chinese star named Bruce Lee in 1973, this was, as the trailer for the film shows, a surprisingly nervously marketed thing, given that we know how it turned out. Note in particular, when you watch this trailer, how the undoubted main attraction, and indeed the only thing anyone can really remember about the film, actually plays third fiddle to the American co-stars. So it's find the... Here you go.
Roper, Williams, and Lee, the Deadly Three, penetrate the secret chambers of an evil island empire.
What do you know about Han? He lives like a king on that island.
totally self-sufficient. A fortress without walls, protected by an invincible army that needs no ordinary weapons. This is Enter the Dragon, the first martial arts film produced by a major Hollywood studio. John Saxon is Roper. He was in it for the money. U.S. karate champion Jim Kelly as Williams. He was there because he had no choice. Black Belt Hall of Fame undisputed martial arts champion and international film star Bruce Lee. His job was to get them out alive.
I'm hoping you'll join us, represent us in the United States. You want me to join this?
Roper, Williams, and Lee. Just when they think they've broken the secret of the island, they find there is no escape from the inscrutable Han. Warner Brothers presents Enter the Dragon, where the world's greatest martial arts athletes meet the ultimate challenge with the most ancient and deadly of weapons, the human body. Enter the Dragon from Warner Brothers.
So there you go, and I don't know if anyone else could actually remember who Jim Kelly and the other one were, but everybody remembers who Bruce Lee is, but clearly the producers were not actually that confident that people would go and see a film with a Chinese star at that point. Of course, after the film's release, Bruce Lee's profile ensured that similar nervousness would not be quite so apparent on future ventures. Despite Lee's death before the completion of his next film, the market for martial arts and Asian stories was then established. The immediate precursor to Monkey on British television was a series called The Water Margin, which I personally haven't seen, but it was made in 1973, and it was made by Nippon Television, who were also the production company behind Monkey. The Water Margin was adapted from another classic Chinese novel, and from what I can gather, it was a story of warring clans, families, and armies filmed on mainland China. And it was clearly a high quality, but mostly fairly recognizable species of historical costume drama in some ways. So although it laid the commercial ground for its successor, it probably didn't really prepare audiences for what was coming next. And what came next was, of course, this. As we've seen, it's like a fairly singular story in which an anti-authoritarian, supernaturally gifted monkey takes on the heavens and in penance joins forces with a dragon horse, a lustful pig monster, and a philosophical cannibal to escort a male monk, who is played in the series by a woman, the late Masako Natsume, and to escort him to India across a landscape filled with monsters, demons, and spirits. Fighting, innuendo, dubbed dialogue, bucket loads of colour. It was something that hadn't been seen on British TV before and possibly won't be seen in quite the same way again. But before going on to watch the first episode of that series, which, as I've said before, takes us on a whistle-stop tour of the first 7 chapters of the novel, it's worth pointing out that the 1978 Japanese version was not the last. In Asian markets, a whole range of film, TV, computer game, musical, theatrical, and comic book takes on this story have appeared. We've also had an opera staged at the Manchester International Festival by Jamie Hewlett and Damon Albarn, which was linked to that Olympics clip earlier. There have been 2 new versions, a cinema film and a TV series, released in the first half of 2011 alone. So, to sign off and ahead of beginning the screening of the 1978 Monkey, it might be interesting to just look at an extra excerpt from one of these later versions. And this is, the only one I could find was actually a Korean trailer for Stephen Chow, who's now quite well known in the West for things like Shaolin Soccer and things like that. But in 1995, he made an action comedy in 2 parts called A Chinese Odyssey, which obviously used an awful lot of monkey in it. And so if only for purposes of comparison and to prove that monkey lives on as a trickster and great sage equal of heaven, it's worth looking at these, even if, these things don't always actually reach our television screens. So here we go. So there you go, really. That takes us pretty much up to date. And I suppose if we can start the screening of the episode, and then if there's time after that, we'll maybe have some questions if people feel inclined to ask any. So I think we just need to switch over to the DVD, and that'll be fine.
In the worlds before Monkey, primal chaos reigned. Heaven sought order,